and they're pimps and whores because they can't write their own name to earn a living properly. They got to lean on somebody else, which brought about the title of Pimps and Whores.
And they're pimps and whores since they can't even write their own signature to make a living for themselves. Rather than standing on their own 2 feet, they must lean on someone else. This need, this dependence on others to survive, is what created the title of Pimps and Whores in the first place. Frank Sinatra once growled, finally calling the 5 stars he despised the most. The board chairman, as he was universally nicknamed, never did mince words. Beneath the charm, beneath the magnetic presence on stage, and behind the suave velvet voice, there was a man who could hold grudges like no one else in Hollywood. In a single explosive and unusual disclosure, Sinatra left no doubt as to who his adversaries were, naming the bitter names that continue to surprise fans even today. Marlon Brando. Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando, 2 of the biggest stars of mid-20th century Hollywood, could not have been more dissimilar in style and attitude, in approach to life, work, and art. Their legendary animosity stemmed from their work on the 1955 musical Guys and Dolls. What started out as tension over creative differences developed into one of Hollywood's most renowned feuds, a bitter dispute that illustrated how 2 strong egos and opposing approaches could fuel hostility that would last a lifetime. Frank Sinatra was already a multifaceted entertainer by the mid-1950s. Not only was he a celebrated singer whose silky and charismatic voice swept audiences around the globe, but also an actor who had established critical credibility and even received an Academy Award for From Here to Eternity 1953. Sinatra's acting style was deeply influenced by his musical and live-performing background. He appreciated efficiency and directness and a no-nonsense attitude on the set. For him, the greatest performances were improvised, and he tended to like to get through his scenes as rapidly as possible with minimal ado. Marlon Brando, meanwhile, was the epitome of the method acting revolution that was then sweeping Hollywood. His own approach favored intense psychological immersion, and he had to live his characters both emotionally and intellectually. Brando's performances in A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951, and On the Waterfront, 1954, had changed the face of screen acting, and he had earned a reputation as the most committed and serious actor of his generation. Thus, when the 2 were paired together in Guys and Dolls, Sinatra as Nathan Detroit, Brando as Sky Masterson, it was only natural that sparks would fly. Sinatra introduced his own trademark charm and swift professionalism to the role, demanding short shooting schedules and insisting on getting through scenes in 1 or 2 takes. For him, over-rehearsal ruined the magic. Brando, on the other hand, insisted on time and space to prepare emotionally, refusing outright to act if he didn't feel he had fully become his character. His famously subtle, mumbling performance outraged Sinatra, who taunted him with the cruel nickname Mumbles, calling Brando's approach pretentious and slow. Brando retorted in kind, calling Sinatra a Goomba, an Italian-American street slang that meant someone rough and crass, even unsophisticated. To Brando, Sinatra represented show business, tinsel disguising itself as art, and the slur was a reflection of his contempt. Their exchange soon turned less about acting technique and more about identity, culture, and ego. Sinatra demanded professionalism but confused it with speed and discipline, while Brando felt rushed and disdained. Cast and crew remembered fierce shouting matches, icy stare-downs, and passive-aggressive barbs that contaminated the set. Whenever Sinatra and Brando were in a scene together, tension was palpable. To Sinatra, who had struggled so hard to transcend the taint of being just a singer and be considered seriously as an actor, Brando's disdain touched a nerve. Brando, in turn, regarded Sinatra as superficial, a creation of commercial Hollywood glamour over genuine craft. Their dislike of each other became intensely personal, directed by contentious temperaments, origins, and egos. The feud did not die when Guys and Dolls closed. Rather, it persisted for decades and turned up in gossip columns, interviews, and stories told by movie insiders. Sinatra continued to mock Brando's acting style, and Brando never mellowed his disdain for Sinatra's image. While not always making the news, the hatred continued, a textbook instance of how two giants were never able to put away their differences. More generally, their battle came to represent a cultural shift in Hollywood. Sinatra was the old guard, the performer whose power resided in naturalness, charm, and rapidity. Brando was the new generation of psychological realism and immersion-based craft, willing to trade efficiency for emotional truth. Their battle was personal, but also symbolic of a broader war within the film industry, a conflict between tradition and modernity, between surface and depth. John Wayne. If Sinatra's conflict with Brando was one of art, his conflict with John Wayne was one of ideology. The Duke, as Wayne was popularly called, was the personification of rough-hewn patriotism and hard-right conservatism. His movies extolled military heroism, frontier tough guy existence, and traditional American virtues. In real life, Wayne was no less outspoken, publicly defending Republican ideals and cautioning against communism's expansion. Sinatra, on the other hand, gravitated toward liberal and progressive causes. He was a good friend and vocal campaigner for John F. Kennedy, whom he assisted in his campaign in 1960. Sinatra was a supporter of civil rights and accepted the social revolution sweeping the nation, placing him squarely at odds with Wayne's aggressive conservatism. Their political disagreement boiled over in public animosity during the release of Wayne's 1960 pet project, The Alamo. Wayne saw the film as a patriotic epic celebrating sacrifice and American exceptionalism. Sinatra called it jingoistic, believing its unapologetic patriotism to be simplistic and even unsettling during the paranoid Cold War era. Wayne interpreted Sinatra's criticism as a personal affront, not only to his film but to his values. The animosity intensified. Wayne freely confessed in interviews that he couldn't stand Sinatra, an unusually honest comment for a normally taciturn actor. Sinatra embodied for Wayne Hollywood elitism, perilously disconnected from what he defined as real America. Sinatra saw Wayne's hardline conservatism and macho image as intolerant, and the two men never closed the rift. Their quarrel was more than a clash of egos. It reflected the profound ideological fault line of America in the 1960s, the struggle between conservatism and liberalism, traditionalism and social transformation. Hollywood, like America itself, was divided, and the division between Sinatra and Wayne epitomized those fault lines. Peter Lawford. The most intimate of Sinatra's feuds was with Peter Lawford, his one-time close friend and fellow member of the Rat Pack. Lawford's marriage to Patricia Kennedy bound him to the family of President John F. Kennedy, and this tie-in was invaluable to Sinatra. Lawford was his path to the White House. In 1962, though it all fell apart, Sinatra had set up his Palm Springs home for presidential visitation, viewing it as the ultimate seal of approval for his political standing. When the Kennedy administration, dreading scandal regarding Sinatra's alleged mob ties, backed out, Lawford was the bearer of the bad news. Sinatra viewed this as the ultimate betrayal. In a fit of rage, Sinatra expelled Lawford from the Rat Pack, even benching him for Bing Crosby in the group's 1964 movie Robin and the Seven Hoods. The public shaming was indelible. Lawford never got back Sinatra's friendship, and the treachery tormented the two men the rest of their lives. The schism represented the seamy side of Hollywood's salacious entanglement with politics and organized crime. Sinatra's mob connections, actual or inflated, gave him glamour, but also rendered him politically poisonous. Lawford, caught between friendship and family loyalties, chose the Kennedys, and for Sinatra, that was a betrayal. Ava Gardner. Sinatra's affair with Ava Gardner, his second wife, was the most tempestuous of all. Their 1951 to 1957 marriage was a whirlwind of passion and demolition, recalled as one of Hollywood's most fiery marriages. Gardner, one of the loveliest and most independent women of her time, was both Sinatra's best love and his worst torment. Their chemistry was undeniable, but their fights were the stuff of legend, blowout fights that frequently escalated into physicality and left splintered furniture and shattered glass behind. Both were passionate, both were prideful, and both were burdened with personal demons. Sinatra fought career, stress, and adultery, while Gardner fought booze and an intense need to be on her own. Even amidst the turmoil, there was sweetness. Sinatra vented his passion for Gardner in his music, and Gardner himself acknowledged in later life that he was the love of her life. But when they were divorced, the acrimony lingered. Gardner struck back in interviews with acid barbs, and Sinatra replied with hurtful silence or mocking one-liners. Their relationship, even in its destruction, was unforgettable, a love affair too powerful to last, yet too profound to ever pass. The lasting chemistry between Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner represented the complicated blend of love and devastation that characterized so many iconic Hollywood affairs. Though they divorced in 1957, the emotional connections between them never really disentangled. Friends and insiders used to comment that Gardner's biting observations of Sinatra in interviews, albeit biting on the surface, always had a residue of lingering hurt, as though her bitterness hid a wound that never fully closed. For Sinatra, the affair with Gardner was one of the signature books of his life that influenced not just his personal path, but also his art. Most of the torch songs he cut during and after they were together, filled with yearning, regret, and anguish passion, were commonly assumed to be about his stormy love for her. His singing during that period had an emotional force that listeners sensed intensely, as if the sorrow was inscribed in every breath. Even in their old age, many years after the divorce, and many years after each of them had gone on to other relationships, they were always mentioned together. Sinatra's reticence regarding Gardner was only occasionally broken by a dry or wry remark, a reticence that appeared to indicate that certain wounds were too intimate, too fresh, to ever be openly revealed to the world. Gardner, however, was honest about her opinion of him, frequently oscillating between admitting him to be the love of my life and lambasting him with the same passion that had previously ignited their love. Their saga is among the most enthralling instances of how love, vanity, and self-annihilating power can entwine, producing a legacy that is both tragic and indelible. Sinatra and Gardner's union might have been brief, but its resonance never dissipated from their lives or Hollywood lore. The last two feuds, though Sinatra's run-ins with Marlon Brando, John Wayne, Peter Lawford, and Ava Gardner were among the most notable, they were not the only celebrities to make his list of most despised stars. Throughout the years, his legend for being brutally honest and also his inability to forgive perceived insults resulted in more than a few being the target of his wrath. Sinatra's grudges meant more than personal disdain. They were connected with matters of loyalty, respect, politics, or artistic principle. Betrayal was never a minor issue to him, whether from an actor on the set, a colleague entertainer within his inner circle, or even a loved one. Once Sinatra determined a person had crossed him, that animosity could endure for decades, tainting every encounter and becoming indelibly etched in Hollywood legend. Even in death in 1998, the tales of Sinatra's feuds persist, entrancing fans and scholars alike. These rivalries were never ego-driven. They were driven by competing values, identities, and ideas about what Hollywood, art, and even America itself should stand for. From Brando's method-acting fervor that conflicted with Sinatra's old-fashioned competence, to Wayne's right-wing patriotism that conflicted with Sinatra's left-wing politics, to Lawford's alleged betrayal that lost him his spot in the Rat Pack, to Gardner's passionate love affair that became lasting bitterness, each of these rivalries had its own story. Together, they sketched a portrait of Frank Sinatra not just as an artist and icon, but as a man who lived life on his own terms, a man intensely protective of his pride, values, and heart. His legacy, then, is not just in the songs he recorded or the pictures he appeared in, but in the passionate, messy, very human relationships that characterized him. Frank Sinatra was a charming, brilliant, incredible talented man, but also a man of grudges, fights, and hurt that never quite healed. And it is this very duality, the intermingling of glamour and toughness, sweetness and hardness, that makes his life so compelling.